"You don't belong here." The words sliced through the air, sharp and cold. A statement, not a question. A judgment, not a misunderstanding. The officer stood in the middle of the courtroom, feet planted firmly, one hand resting on his baton, the other hovering over his holster. His eyes, narrowed in suspicion, locked onto the man in the perfectly tailored suit, standing near the judge's bench. He didn't recognize him, and that was enough. "I said, you don't belong here." His voice carried the weight of authority, laced with irritation, a demand for obedience. The man held his ground. He exhaled slowly, his face calm, unreadable. "I have every right to be here." A scoff, a smirk. "Oh yeah? And what exactly gives you that right?" There was a pause, heavy, electric, dangerous. The man adjusted his suit jacket, straightened his posture, but he didn't answer. He didn't need to. His presence alone should have been enough. But it wasn't. Because in that officer's mind, no black man dressed like that had any business standing in that position, inside this courtroom, with that level of confidence. He had seen plenty of men like him before, men who thought they were more than they really were. His grip on the baton tightened. "Last chance. Leave. Or I'll make you." The room had fallen silent. Lawyers, court staff, even security, all watching. Some shifting uncomfortably, others pretending not to notice. No one stepping in. No one stopping what was about to happen. The man's expression didn't change. "You're making a mistake." "A mistake?" The officer sneered. The arrogance. The entitlement. Who did this guy think he was? His patience snapped like a brittle thread. Before another word could be spoken, before the man could explain himself, before anyone could intervene, the officer kicked him in the back, sending him crashing to the ground. A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. Papers scattered. A lawyer dropped her pen. Someone's phone hit the floor. The impact was loud, jarring, and final. For a long, breathless moment, there was nothing. Then, movement. The man pushed himself up, slow and deliberate. He brushed off his sleeves, straightened his tie, adjusted his cufflinks. No rage. No panic. No retaliation. Just quiet, controlled defiance. And then, he turned. The officer's smirk faded as his eyes met the man's for the first time. A slow, creeping realization crawled up his spine. The weight of the moment crashed down all at once. Because the man he had just assaulted. The man he had humiliated. The man he had kicked to the ground like he was nothing. Was the judge. A wave of disbelief swept through the room. Someone gasped. Someone else muttered a curse under their breath. Lawyers whispered. Officers shifted uncomfortably. The judge took a step forward. The officer's mouth opened, but no words came out. His pulse hammered in his throat. The judge didn't need to say anything. His very existence, his very presence, was a statement on its own. A living, breathing contradiction to every assumption the officer had made. The officer had kicked a judge to the ground. A black judge. Inside a courtroom. In front of witnesses. The room felt smaller. Hotter. The officer could feel every pair of eyes digging into him. And then, just as suddenly as it had happened, the balance of power shifted. Because now, he was the one out of place. Now, he was the one who didn't belong. And in that moment, his entire life began to crumble. The question wasn't if there would be consequences. The question was, just how far would they go? Hey there, before we dive into today's story, we want to make one thing crystal clear: Plow of Twist stands against all forms of racism and discrimination. This channel believes in justice, equality, and the power of storytelling to expose the truth and inspire change. If you've ever faced injustice or prejudice, know that you are seen, you are valued, and you are not alone. Now, sit back and get ready for a powerful story of karma, justice, and an unexpected twist. If you love gripping stories with shocking turnarounds, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Let's get into it. The atmosphere inside the courthouse was thick with the hum of legal battles waiting to unfold. Lawyers strode through the hallways with calculated precision, their polished shoes clicking against the pristine marble floors. Clerks maneuvered through the controlled chaos, their arms burdened with stacks of legal documents that contained the weight of people's lives in fine print. The air carried the faint aroma of burnt coffee, the lingering scent of freshly printed paper, and the aged wood of the courthouse benches, familiar notes in the grand symphony of justice. At the heart of this institution, Judge Malcolm Wright walked with a steady, purposeful stride. He was a man who had climbed every rung of the legal system with sheer intellect and unrelenting perseverance. His very presence in this courthouse was a statement, a testament to battles won long before he ever put on a judge's robe. At just 42 years old, he was one of the youngest judges ever appointed in the district, and the first black judge to hold this position. His success was celebrated by some, tolerated by others, and outright despised by a select few. To his supporters, he was proof of progress. A symbol of what was possible when talent and hard work were given a seat at the table. To his critics, he was an anomaly. A disruption to the system, an intrusion into a space where men like him had not been meant to exist. They viewed him with quiet skepticism, questioning his rulings before he even made them, waiting for him to fail. And then, there were people like Officer Brian Carter. Brian had been in law enforcement for 15 years. He had built his entire career on instinct, the ability to read a situation before it escalated. His gut told him who was dangerous, who was out of place, who needed to be dealt with. In his mind, the world was divided into two kinds of people, those who upheld the law, and those who broke it. And to him, Malcolm Wright didn't fit the first category. It wasn't because of anything Malcolm had done, it was because of what he represented. From the moment Malcolm had stepped into this courthouse, Brian had watched him with suspicion. He had seen the way Malcolm carried himself with authority, how people listened when he spoke, how his presence demanded respect rather than asked for it. It unsettled Brian in a way he couldn't quite articulate. Men like Malcolm Wright weren't supposed to exist in places like this. Not in his world. That morning, Brian was already in a foul mood. The courthouse had been unusually busy, cases piling up, tensions running high. He had no patience for nonsense. So when he saw a man, black, well-dressed, but unfamiliar, standing near the judge's bench in an otherwise empty courtroom, his instincts kicked in. Something about the scene felt wrong. He didn't recognize the man. He wasn't wearing a judge's robe, nor was he accompanied by any clerks or security personnel. He stood there, too comfortable, too at ease for someone who didn't belong. Brian straightened his posture, squared his shoulders, and strode forward, already anticipating the confrontation. "Step away from there," Brian ordered, his voice sharp, cutting through the quiet air of the courtroom. The man turned to face him, his expression calm, unreadable. "Excuse me." Brian took another step closer, his stance unwavering. Something in him already decided that this man didn't belong. "You're in a restricted area," Brian said, his hand instinctively resting near his baton. "You need to leave. Now." A slow inhale. A pause heavy enough to make the room feel smaller. "I work here," the man responded evenly. Brian's lips curled into a smirk, as if he had just caught someone in a lie. "Oh yeah? And what exactly gives you that right?" The man's posture remained steady, his expression unreadable. He didn't explain himself. He didn't offer credentials or argue his case. He just stood there, existing in a space Brian had already decided he didn't belong in. That alone was enough. Brian's grip on his baton tightened. "Last warning," he said, his patience stretched thin. "Move. Or I'll move you." And then, the man spoke again. "You're making a mistake." There was no arrogance in his voice, no threat, no desperation, just a quiet certainty, as if he had already seen the outcome of this encounter before it even began. But Brian didn't care. Because he had already made up his mind. In one swift, decisive motion, Brian lifted his foot and drove a forceful kick into the man's back, sending him crashing onto the cold, hard floor. The impact was violent, a sharp thud that echoed through the courtroom. Papers scattered from the nearby desks, the silence now shattered by gasps of disbelief. A lawyer standing by the doorway dropped her folder. Someone else muttered an expletive under their breath. The weight of what had just happened sunk into the room like a stone tossed into still water. Brian stood over the man, chest heaving, adrenaline surging through his veins. He had done what needed to be done. Another lesson taught. Another trespasser put in his place. For a long, stretched moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, movement. The man pushed himself up, his movement steady, deliberate. He dusted off his sleeves, adjusted his tie with meticulous precision. He didn't panic. He didn't lash out. He didn't show anger. He simply stood. And then, he turned. Brian's smirk faltered. His pulse quickened. For the first time, he really looked at the man's face. His breath caught in his throat. His stomach twisted. His mind scrambled to undo the moment, to rewrite what had just happened, to find a way out, but it was too late. Because this wasn't some random intruder. This wasn't a trespasser. This wasn't a criminal who had wandered into the wrong place. This was Judge Malcolm Wright. The realization slammed into Brian like a wrecking ball. His world tilted on its axis. The room, which had once felt entirely in his control, now felt like a trap. He had just assaulted a judge. Not just any judge, the judge of this very courthouse. A man with power. A man with influence. A man whose word could end careers. A black judge. A man he had assumed, without hesitation, had no right to be here. But now, Brian was the one who didn't belong. A shift occurred, one Brian had never experienced before. The power he had held just seconds ago was gone. Malcolm took a step forward. Brian stepped back. He had spent years making men like Malcolm afraid. Making them feel small. Making them second-guess their place in the world. But now, for the first time in his life, he was the one with something to fear. The silence that filled the courtroom was suffocating, pressing against the walls, thick with the weight of what had just happened. The tension in the air was almost unbearable, a crushing force that settled over every single person in the room. It was as if time had slowed, stretching each second into something longer, heavier, more permanent. Every eye in the room was locked onto Brian Carter, the once confident officer who now stood frozen in place, his hands still clenched at his sides, his entire body rigid with shock. Judge Malcolm Wright had not spoken again since standing to his full height, brushing the dust from his perfectly tailored suit, and turning to face the man who had just kicked him to the ground in front of a room full of witnesses. His expression had not shifted, not once, not even in the smallest way. No anger. No fear. No retaliation. Just control. Unshakable, unrelenting control. And that terrified Brian more than anything. Brian had expected outrage. Had braced himself for a fight, for yelling, for chaos. He had been prepared to deal with resistance, with the same kind of defiance he had spent years shutting down. But what he got instead was something much worse. Silence. A silence that left no room for excuses. No room for negotiation. No room for him. The words Malcolm finally spoke sliced through that silence with a precision that sent a chill straight through Brian's spine. "You," Malcolm said, his voice steady, composed, every syllable deliberate, just assaulted a judge inside his own courtroom. The words carried an undeniable weight, and Brian felt their impact in the very marrow of his bones. His breath stalled in his throat, his heartbeat thundering in his ears so loudly he could barely hear the gasps rippling through the room. Brian opened his mouth, but nothing came out. Malcolm took a single step forward. The sound of his shoe meeting the polished floor was deafening in the stillness. Every single person in the room was watching. "Tell me, Officer Carter," Malcolm continued, tilting his head just slightly, the calculated movement making Brian's stomach twist. "What exactly do you think happens next?" Brian's throat was dry. His instincts screamed at him to do something, say something, regain control before it was too late. He had been in situations before where people had looked at him like this, had challenged him, questioned his decisions, pushed back against his authority. But never like this. Never with certainty. Before he could find his voice, another voice sliced through the air. "What the hell is going on here?" Brian turned sharply, his pulse spiking when he saw Captain James Holloway, his superior, storming into the courtroom with quick, forceful strides. The captain's face was tight, his jaw clenched, his narrowed gaze bouncing between Malcolm and Brian before settling on Brian with pure disbelief. Malcolm did not hesitate. He did not stall the way Brian was stalling. "Your officer physically assaulted me in my own courtroom," Malcolm stated, his words sharp, cutting through the lingering silence like a blade. "In front of multiple witnesses." Brian's entire body went rigid. This wasn't happening. It couldn't be happening. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. Captain Holloway's face darkened. "Is that true?" His voice was low, controlled, dangerous. Brian's jaw tightened. This was his last chance to get ahead of this, to turn the situation around, to fix it before it was too late. He refused to identify himself, Brian said quickly, forcing authority back into his voice. "I gave multiple warnings." He wouldn't comply. Malcolm's lips twitched, just slightly. Not quite a smirk. Not quite a frown. Just certainty. "That's interesting," Malcolm mused, his tone even, unshaken. "Because I distinctly remember telling you I had every right to be here." He paused, just long enough for his next words to sink deep beneath Brian's skin. "But you weren't interested in listening to facts, were you, Officer Carter?" The courtroom was deathly silent. Brian's fingers curled into fists at his sides. This wasn't how things were supposed to happen. This wasn't how his world worked. Captain Holloway exhaled sharply, dragging a hand down his face before fixing Brian with a stare so sharp it felt like it could cut through steel. "Christ, Brian," Holloway muttered, his voice low and filled with something close to disgust. "Do you have any idea what you just did?" Brian clenched his teeth, his entire body burning with the heat of so many eyes watching him unravel. "Captain, it's not up for debate," Holloway snapped, stepping closer, his voice dropping into a furious whisper. "You just assaulted a sitting judge in broad daylight. On camera. With witnesses. What the hell do you think I'm supposed to do?" Brian's stomach twisted violently. His badge. His gun. His entire career. Captain Holloway's expression hardened. "Hand them over. Now." Brian stopped breathing. A sharp inhale. A ringing in his ears. No. This wasn't happening. His fingers trembled as he reached for his badge, as if his own body couldn't process the reality of what he was doing. The weight of it was unbearable. The metal felt like a death sentence in his hands. He placed it in Holloway's outstretched palm, followed by his gun, the cold metal slipping from his grasp like the last piece of control he would ever hold. The moment his hands were empty, the shift in the room became undeniable. The officers who had stood behind him just moments ago now seemed distant, unmoving, their gazes unreadable. The lawyers, the clerks, the court staff, every single person had just watched his world collapse in real time. And then, as if the humiliation couldn't possibly get any worse, Brian saw them. The reporters. Standing at the edge of the courtroom, cameras raised, microphones poised. Of course, they were here. This wasn't just a mistake. This was a scandal. A headline. A career-ending catastrophe. Malcolm exhaled softly, shaking his head just once before walking past Brian, his movements slow, deliberate, unstoppable. As he reached the door, he glanced back, just for a second. His voice, quiet, calm, yet utterly damning. "I warned you." And then, he was gone. Brian's heartbeat roared inside his chest. His fingers curled into fists. His mind raced for solutions, for excuses, for some way, any way, to stop what was about to happen. Because this wasn't over. No. This was just the beginning. The sharp, sterile scent of the precinct clung to the air like a permanent stain. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly above, flickering with an eerie rhythm that only seemed to intensify the weight pressing down on Brian Carter's chest. The waiting area was emptier than usual, yet it felt suffocating, the silence stretching out between him and Captain Holloway, who stood in front of him with his arms crossed, eyes locked onto him like a judge waiting for a confession. Brian sat with his elbows on his knees, his fingers clasped together so tightly that his knuckles had turned white. He had barely spoken since handing over his badge and gun. Since Malcolm Wright had walked out of that courtroom, leaving behind a mess that Brian had no idea how to clean up. Holloway exhaled, long and slow, shaking his head as he rubbed a hand over his face. "You have any idea what kind of storm you just walked into?" Brian finally looked up. His jaw was tight, his mind racing for a way out of this. "I didn't know who he was." "And that makes it better." Holloway's voice was sharp, disbelief threading through every syllable. "Jesus, Brian. You didn't think for 1 second to ask before putting your hands on him?" Before kicking him to the ground like he was, he stopped himself, pressing his fingers to his temple, as if the weight of the situation was physically painful. Brian sat up straighter, forcing himself to sound more certain than he felt. "I was following protocol." He was in a restricted area. He wouldn't comply. Holloway's laughter was short and humorless. "And you really think that argument's gonna hold up? The man you just assaulted is one of the most respected judges in this city. He's been on the bench for years. He's got people in his corner that would bury you without blinking." Brian's throat tightened. He knew Malcolm had power, but this was worse than he thought. Before he could respond, the heavy metal door to the interrogation room swung open, and a voice cut through the tension. "Let's not waste any more time. We all know why we're here." Malcolm Wright stepped inside, his presence shifting the energy in the room instantly. His suit was impeccable, his expression unreadable. He didn't look at Brian right away. He took his time, walking to the empty chair across from him, unbuttoning his jacket before sitting down. Every movement was deliberate. Controlled. Holloway cleared his throat, glancing between the two men before stepping back. "Judge Wright, leave us," Malcolm said, his voice smooth, but carrying an edge that left no room for argument. Holloway hesitated. With all due respect, Malcolm's eyes met his, steady, firm. "I won't ask twice." The captain exhaled sharply, glancing at Brian once before stepping toward the door. "I'll be right outside," he muttered, pushing the door shut behind him. And then, there was nothing. Just silence. Brian swallowed hard, forcing himself to meet Malcolm's gaze. The judge studied him, unmoving, his fingers laced together on the table. "How long have you been a cop, Officer Carter?" Brian shifted, caught off guard by the question. 15 years. Malcolm nodded, as if filing the answer away. 15 years, he repeated. "That's a long time. A long time to learn how things work. To learn how to read people. Tell me, in all those years, have you ever been wrong about someone?" Brian's jaw tightened. "I do my job." "That's not what I asked." Malcolm tilted his head slightly, studying him. "You were so sure about me, weren't you? You didn't hesitate. You didn't question yourself. You looked at me, and you already had the whole story written in your head. Brian clenched his fists under the table. You were in a restricted area. Malcolm's lips twitched, something dangerously close to amusement flickering in his eyes. That's the excuse you're going with? That I was somewhere I didn't belong. Brian's stomach turned. Malcolm leaned back slightly, exhaling slowly. Tell me, Officer Carter. When you put your hands on me, when you kicked me to the ground in front of an entire courtroom, what exactly did you think was going to happen next? Did you think I'd stay down? Did you think no one would say anything? Or did you think, he paused, letting the silence stretch between them like a taut wire. Did you think I wouldn't matter enough for it to be a problem? Brian's fingers twitched. You can answer honestly, Malcolm continued, his voice calm, unwavering. I already know the truth. I just want to hear you say it. Brian's throat felt like sandpaper. His entire career had been built on control. On being the one in charge. On never being questioned, never having to justify himself. But now, he was being dissected piece by piece, and he had no way out. Malcolm exhaled, nodding slightly. You know, I've dealt with men like you my whole life. Men who walk into a room and decide who belongs and who doesn't before a single word is spoken. Men who let their instincts, he said the word like it was something foul, something rotten. Tell them everything they need to know. Brian's pulse pounded in his ears. Are you here to lecture me, or do you want something? Malcolm smiled. It wasn't kind. Oh, I already got what I wanted, Officer Carter. Brian's stomach twisted. Do you think you still have a career after this? Malcolm asked, his voice low, almost amused. Do you think your union's going to protect you? That the department's going to take this hit for you? That anyone in that courthouse will forget what they saw? Brian's heart pounded. Malcolm's voice remained even, measured. They're going to make an example out of you. The department needs to make an example out of you. And do you know why? He let the question hang for a beat. Because I am not the first man you've done this to. But I am the first man who could destroy your entire life with a single signature. Brian's mouth went dry. Malcolm leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. And the best part? His voice dropped to something just above a whisper. I don't even have to do anything. You already did it to yourself. Brian's breath came in sharp, uneven pulls. He wanted to speak. To argue. To fight back. But the truth sat between them, undeniable, unshakable, inescapable. This wasn't just the end of his career. This was the end of him. Malcolm exhaled, rising to his feet, buttoning his jacket with smooth precision. He glanced down at Brian one last time, his expression unreadable. Good luck, Officer Carter, he said, voice cool, calm, final. And then he turned. The door opened. Malcolm walked out. And Brian Carter was left alone in the silence, his entire world crumbling around him. Brian Carter sat frozen in the cold, lifeless room, the dull hum of the overhead lights pressing down on him like a weight he couldn't shake. His heartbeat pounded in his ears, the reality of the situation settling deeper into his chest with each passing second. His mouth felt dry, his fingers twitching slightly against the surface of the table, the echoes of Malcolm Wright's words still lingering in the air like a scent he couldn't wash off. His badge was gone. His gun was gone. His power, his career, his very sense of self, gone. The door creaked open, and Brian's head snapped up as Holloway stepped inside, the captain's face twisted with barely contained frustration. He shut the door behind him with a heavy thud, exhaling through his nose as he crossed his arms, his eyes burning with something that made Brian's stomach churn. You have any idea how bad this is? Holloway's voice was low, sharp, carrying the kind of weight that made it clear this wasn't a conversation, it was a reckoning. The video's everywhere. The whole damn city's seen it. You know what that means. Brian's jaw clenched. He knew. He had known the second Malcolm walked out of that room with his head held high and the world at his back. It means they're throwing you to the wolves, Holloway continued, his voice edged with something between disbelief and fury. The department can't save you from this, Brian. No one can. You're not just a cop who screwed up, you're the face of a national scandal. Brian's stomach twisted. He had never been afraid of losing control before, but now it was slipping away faster than he could grab onto it. I can fix this, Brian forced out, his voice rough, desperate, but Holloway only let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. Fix it? Jesus, Brian, do you hear yourself? You don't fix something like this. This isn't a bad arrest or a minor use of force complaint, you assaulted a judge. In front of witnesses. On camera. Tell me, what part of that do you think you can fix? Brian swallowed hard. His fingers twitched again, but his hands were useless, just sitting there on the table like they no longer belonged to him. I didn't know who he was, Brian muttered, the words falling flat the second they left his mouth, because even to him, they felt empty now. Holloway's nostrils flared. And that's supposed to make it better? That's supposed to justify what you did? His voice dropped lower, dangerous now. Tell me something, Brian. If he hadn't been a judge, if he had just been another black man standing in that courtroom, would you have done anything different? Brian's chest felt tight. His mouth opened, but nothing came out. Holloway shook his head, disgust flashing across his face. That's what I thought. A thick silence stretched between them, heavy, suffocating. Brian's hands curled into fists, his nails biting into his palms. He wanted to speak, to argue, to say something that could turn this around, but the words never came. Because deep down, he knew. There was nothing left to say. The door opened again, and this time, Brian felt his breath hitch in his throat as Malcolm Wright stepped inside once more, the same unshakable, deliberate presence he had carried into every room since the moment this nightmare had begun. Only now the weight of it was unbearable. Malcolm said nothing at first, his gaze sweeping over the room before landing on Brian, unreadable, unmoving. Then he turned to Holloway, his voice steady. I need a moment alone with him. Holloway hesitated, glancing at Brian, something flickering in his expression, something almost like pity, before exhaling sharply and nodding. Without another word, he turned and stepped out, leaving the door to click shut behind him. And then it was just the two of them. Brian inhaled sharply, forcing himself to straighten, to hold on to something, anything that felt like control. But Malcolm wasn't in a rush. He moved with an ease that made Brian's stomach twist, lowering himself into the chair across from him with that same calculated precision, his hands clasped together on the table. You know, Malcolm finally spoke, his voice calm, even, dangerous in its quietness. I've been thinking a lot about that moment in the courtroom. About what was going through your head. What made you so sure you were right? Brian exhaled, his jaw tightening. I thought I was doing my job. Malcolm nodded slowly, as if considering that. Your job, he repeated. And what exactly do you think that job is? Brian's fingers twitched. To keep people safe. Malcolm let out a quiet breath, almost like a laugh, but there was no humor in it. Safe, he echoed, tilting his head slightly, his gaze never wavering. Tell me, Officer Carter. Who were you keeping safe when you put your hands on me? When you kicked me to the floor without hesitation, without a single question? Who was the danger in that room? Because from where I was standing, the only person in that courtroom abusing power, was you. Brian's pulse thundered in his ears. Malcolm leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping lower. You know, I don't think you ever asked yourself that question before today. I don't think you ever had to. Brian swallowed. His hands clenched into fists again, but Malcolm wasn't finished. You had power, Malcolm continued. You had control. And you thought that meant you were untouchable. You thought that meant you could act first and ask questions later. And maybe you were right, until today. Brian's breath came short, uneven. You see, Officer Carter, this time, you picked the wrong man, Malcolm said, his voice smooth, like steel wrapped in silk. This time, you picked someone who has the power to fight back. And for the first time in your life, you're going to see what it feels like to be on the other side of that power. Brian felt his stomach drop. Malcolm's eyes didn't waver. There are consequences for men like you. Not often. Not enough. But this time, there will be. Brian's mouth felt like sandpaper. He forced himself to meet Malcolm's gaze, to hold on to whatever pride he still had left. So what? You're here to tell me my life is over. Malcolm exhaled slowly, his lips twitching. Oh, Officer Carter. Your life isn't over. But the life you thought you had. He shook his head. That's gone. Brian's throat tightened. Malcolm straightened, buttoning his jacket, and for a moment, just a moment, Brian thought he saw something in his expression. Not anger. Not gloating. Something deeper. Pity. And somehow, that was worse. Malcolm turned, stepping toward the door, pausing just before opening it. He glanced back, his voice quieter now. Enjoy your new reality, he said. I hope you learn something from it. And then, just like that, he was gone. Brian Carter sat in the silence, the walls closing in around him, his entire world falling apart in real time. And for the first time in his life, he had no control over it. The interrogation room felt smaller now, suffocating in a way that had nothing to do with its actual size. The air was thick with the kind of tension that settled in the bones, making every breath feel heavier than the last. The harsh fluorescent lighting above flickered slightly, casting an unsteady glow over the cold, lifeless walls. Brian Carter sat in the same rigid position he had been in for what felt like hours, his fingers clasped together so tightly that his knuckles had gone white. His body felt stiff, his throat dry, his mind racing in 1,000 different directions, searching for a way, any way, to make sense of what had just happened. He had spent years in control. Years walking into rooms with his head high, knowing that his badge gave him authority, that his uniform commanded respect. He had been untouchable. But now, everything had changed. His badge was gone. His gun was gone. The authority he had relied on for so long had vanished in an instant, stripped away by a mistake he had convinced himself he'd never make. But was it really a mistake? That question gnawed at the edges of his mind, twisting something deep in his chest. It wasn't a mistake to him when he had done it. He had seen Malcolm Wright standing there in that courtroom and made a decision. The same way he had done 100 times before. The difference this time? He had been wrong. And for the first time, there were consequences. The heavy metal door swung open, snapping him out of his thoughts. He looked up sharply, his heart pounding, only for his stomach to drop as Captain Holloway stepped inside once again. The older man's face was unreadable at first, his expression a careful mask, but Brian knew him well enough to see the tension in his shoulders, the tightness in his jaw, the weight in his eyes. He closed the door behind him with a thud and took a step forward, arms crossed tightly over his chest. You have any idea how bad this is? Holloway's voice was low, sharp, carrying that dangerous edge that only came out when things had gone past the point of no return. Brian swallowed hard. Of course, he knew. Holloway exhaled slowly, dragging a hand down his face. The videos everywhere. Every news station, every website, every damn social media feed, you're viral, Carter. Brian's stomach turned violently. He hadn't even thought about that. You know what that means. Holloway continued, his voice now laced with something between exhaustion and frustration. It means they're throwing you to the wolves. The department's cutting ties. They have no choice. Brian's jaw tightened. They can't just, Holloway laughed, but there was no humor in it. They can, and they are. You think they're going to stand by you after this? You're not just some beat cop who made a mistake on a traffic stop. You're the guy who assaulted a sitting judge in front of an entire courtroom. And it was caught on camera. There's no way out of this, Brian. Brian could feel his pulse roaring in his ears, his chest rising and falling in quick, uneven breaths. I didn't know who he was. Holloway's expression darkened. And that's supposed to make it better. Brian gritted his teeth. I thought I was doing my job. Holloway let out a breath, shaking his head. No, you thought you were above your job. You thought your instincts were enough, that your judgment was law, that you didn't have to question yourself. And now? Now you're sitting on the other side of the table, and guess what? Nobody gives a damn about your instincts now. Brian's fingers curled into fists against the cool surface of the table. He hated the way Holloway was looking at him, hated the way the truth in his words twisted like a knife in his gut. Holloway stepped closer, his voice dropping lower. Tell me something, Brian. If he hadn't been a judge, if he had just been another black man standing in that courtroom, would you have done anything differently? Brian's throat tightened. Holloway's eyes stayed locked onto his. Answer me. Brian wanted to snap back, to argue, to deny, to say anything that would make this moment feel less damning than it was. But he couldn't. Because he already knew the answer. And so did Holloway. The captain let out a slow breath, disappointment heavy in his expression. That's what I thought. The silence that followed was unbearable. You always thought this job meant you were untouchable, Holloway finally said. But let me tell you something, there's always a line. You just never thought you'd be the one crossing it. Brian exhaled shakily, his head pounding. I can fix this. Holloway shook his head. No, Brian. You can't. The weight of those words settled deep in Brian's chest, pressing against his ribs like something heavy and immovable. No way out. No backup plan. No department standing behind him. Just consequences. The door opened again, and this time, Brian felt a sharp jolt of panic as Malcolm Wright stepped inside once more. He moved with that same steady, deliberate energy, his expression unreadable as he adjusted the cuffs of his suit. He didn't sit right away. He simply stood there for a moment, observing, assessing. Brian felt his stomach twist as Malcolm's gaze finally settled on him, calm, unwavering. Holloway glanced between them before stepping toward the door. I'll be right outside. And then, the door clicked shut. Malcolm finally moved, lowering himself into the chair across from Brian, his movements controlled, calculated. He folded his hands together on the table, exhaling softly before speaking. You know, Malcolm said, his voice quiet but firm, I've spent a long time thinking about men like you. Brian tensed. You walk into a room and make a decision before anyone opens their mouth. You tell yourself it's instinct. That it's experience. But really? It's power. Unchecked power. Brian's jaw locked. I did what I thought was right. Malcolm smiled, but there was nothing kind about it. And that's the problem, Officer Carter. You've never stopped to think if your version of right is actually right. Brian's pulse pounded in his ears. Malcolm leaned forward slightly. You always thought that badge meant something. That it gave you the right to judge, to control, to decide who mattered and who didn't. But now? Now you're just another man on the wrong side of the law, hoping for mercy. Brian felt a sharp sting of anger rise in his chest, but he swallowed it down. So what now? You ruin my life. You make an example out of me. Malcolm exhaled slowly. Oh, Brian. You already did that to yourself. Brian's stomach twisted violently. Malcolm stood, buttoning his jacket with smooth precision. He stared down at Brian for a long moment before shaking his head slightly. I hope you learned something from this. And then, he turned. The door opened. And just like that, he was gone. Brian sat there, staring at the empty space Malcolm had left behind, his entire world unraveling around him. For the first time in his life, he truly understood what it felt like to have no control. Brian sat in the cold, suffocating silence of the interrogation room, his hands clasped so tightly that his nails dug into his palms. His pulse was an unsteady thrum beneath his skin, his chest rising and falling with controlled breaths that did nothing to steady the storm raging inside him. The weight of everything, his decisions, his actions, his downfall, pressed down on him like an anchor, heavy and inescapable. His world, the world he had once ruled with authority and certainty, was crumbling piece by piece, and he had no way of stopping it. The door creaked open again, and Brian's head snapped up, his breath catching as his lawyer stepped inside. The man was dressed in a crisp navy suit, his briefcase clutched in one hand, his expression blank, too blank. He didn't acknowledge Brian right away. He simply moved to the chair across from him, setting his briefcase down on the table before exhaling slowly, as if already exhausted by what was about to happen. Brian swallowed hard, forcing himself to speak. "Tell me you have something." The lawyer met his gaze, his face unreadable, his fingers tapping against the metal of the briefcase. "Define something." Brian's chest tightened. "Something that gets me out of this. Something that fixes this." The lawyer sighed, shaking his head slightly. "Brian. There's no fixing this." Brian's stomach dropped. "I spoke to the DA," the lawyer continued, opening his briefcase and pulling out a stack of neatly printed documents. "They're pushing forward with assault on a public official, that alone could get you up to 5 years. Add in the fact that it's a high-profile case, the public scrutiny, the pressure on the department to hold officers accountable, there's not a jury in the world that's going to let you off easy." Brian's breath came out short and uneven. "So what are my options?" The lawyer flipped through the pages, pausing briefly before looking up. "You plead guilty to aggravated assault in exchange for a reduced sentence. 2 years, minimum. Maybe less if we can negotiate probation, but I wouldn't count on it." Brian's vision blurred for a second. 2 years. You think I'm just gonna roll over and accept that? His voice was rough, desperate. The lawyer's lips pressed into a thin line. "You don't have a choice, Brian." Brian slammed his fist against the table, the sound echoing through the room. "Like hell I don't." The lawyer didn't flinch. "Then go to trial. Watch them rip you apart. Watch them play that video over and over until even you start to believe you're the monster they say you are. Watch Malcolm Wright take the stand and personally ensure that the jury sees exactly what you are." Brian's face burned. That judge is going to bury you, Brian. And you know what? You handed him the damn shovel." The words sliced through the air like a knife, sharp and unforgiving. Brian leaned back in his chair, his breath shaking. He had always thought of himself as the one in control, the one who decided who was guilty and who wasn't, who deserved punishment and who walked free. Now, he was the one sitting on the other side of the law. And no one was coming to save him. His lawyer sat back, waiting, letting the silence stretch. Brian's throat tightened. 2 years. The lawyer nodded. "That's the best offer you're gonna get. And if you want my advice, take it. Because if this goes to trial, I guarantee you, it will be worse." Brian exhaled slowly, his hands shaking against his thighs. The door opened again, and Brian barely had time to process before Holloway walked in. The captain's gaze was unreadable, but there was something in his stance, something final. He stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "You have a visitor." Brian frowned. "Who?" Holloway hesitated, just for a second, before glancing toward the door. And then, Malcolm Wright stepped inside. The room turned colder, the walls feeling even smaller than before. Malcolm's movements were smooth, deliberate, each step measured. He didn't sit right away. He simply stood there, watching Brian with that same unshakable expression, the weight of his presence pressing down on every inch of the room. Holloway exchanged a brief look with the lawyer before nodding slightly. "Give them a minute." The lawyer hesitated but eventually gathered his papers, closing his briefcase with a quiet click before following Holloway out. The door shut behind them, leaving only the sound of Brian's unsteady breathing and Malcolm's composed silence. Brian forced himself to meet his gaze, his pulse hammering in his throat. "What the hell do you want?" Malcolm exhaled slowly, finally lowering himself into the chair across from him. He studied Brian for a long moment, then spoke, his voice calm, almost too calm. "I wanted to see you one last time." Brian's stomach twisted. "What for?" Malcolm tilted his head slightly, his gaze steady. "Because I wanted to look you in the eye when you realize that you're not walking away from this. Not this time." Brian clenched his fists. "You here to gloat?" Malcolm's lips twitched, not quite a smirk, not quite a frown. "You think this is about me getting revenge?" He shook his head slightly. "No, Brian. This is about you finally facing what you are." Brian's pulse spiked, his chest tightening. "And what am I?" Malcolm leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping to something just above a whisper. "A man who thought he was untouchable. A man who believed his judgment was law. A man who never once stopped to question whether his actions were right, until he became the one facing judgment." Brian's fingers twitched against the table. Malcolm's voice remained steady, controlled. "You spent years deciding who mattered and who didn't. You never thought about what it felt like to be on the other side of that power. Now you do." Brian exhaled sharply. "You got what you wanted. You ruined my life. What else do you want from me?" Malcolm studied him for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then, finally, he stood. He adjusted his jacket, exhaling softly. "I don't need to do anything else, Brian. You already destroyed yourself." Brian's stomach twisted violently. Malcolm turned toward the door but paused, glancing back just before stepping out. His voice was quiet, final. "I hope you remember this moment for the rest of your life." And then, he was gone. The door shut behind him, leaving Brian sitting in the cold silence of the interrogation room, the weight of his downfall pressing down on him like a stone he could never lift. For the first time in his life, he finally understood what it meant to lose everything. Brian sat motionless, his entire body weighed down by the reality that had finally sunk in. The silence in the interrogation room felt thicker now, more suffocating, as if the walls had closed in just a little more after Malcolm Wright walked out. He could still hear the finality in his voice, could still feel the weight of those last words hanging over him like a verdict that had already been passed. His hands were curled into tight fists on the table, his knuckles pale, his breath uneven. He had spent years believing that he controlled outcomes, that his authority shaped the way things played out. That his word, his decisions, were final. But now, he was just another man sitting in a cold, gray room, waiting for someone else to decide his fate. The irony of it all burned, searing through his chest like a wound that wouldn't stop bleeding. The door creaked open again, breaking the heavy stillness, and Holloway stepped inside. His expression was unreadable, but Brian didn't miss the way his shoulders had shifted, the way his movements felt slower, heavier. He didn't sit this time. He simply stood there, watching Brian for a moment before exhaling deeply. "You know what's coming, don't you?" Brian swallowed hard, but he nodded. There was no point in pretending. No point in fighting against something that had already been decided. Holloway took a step closer, his voice quieter now, but firm. "The DA's moving fast. They don't want this dragging out any longer than necessary. They need to make an example of you." Brian let out a slow, controlled breath. "What's the offer?" Holloway hesitated, just for a second, before giving him a long, measured look. 2 years. No appeal. No bargaining. You take it, or you roll the dice in court. Brian felt his stomach twist. And if I go to trial? Holloway's jaw tightened. You lose. No question. Brian forced himself to sit up straighter, but it felt meaningless. What happens after the 2 years? Holloway studied him for a moment before shaking his head. You know how this works, Brian. You'll never wear that uniform again. No department in the country will touch you. Your pension's gone. You walk out of that cell, and you start over. If you're lucky, you disappear. If not. He let the words hang, but the meaning was clear. Brian's fingers twitched against the table. So that's it? His voice was low, rough. 15 years, gone just like that. Holloway's face hardened. 15 years of what, Brian? Of doing whatever the hell you wanted because you thought no one would ever check you? You want sympathy. You want me to tell you this is unfair. His voice sharpened. You think I don't know the kind of officer you were? That I didn't hear the complaints, see the reports. You got away with a hell of a lot more than you should have, and now you finally got caught. Brian's jaw clenched. I did my job. Holloway's laugh was short and humorless. Yeah. And what exactly do you think your job was? Making sure men like Wright knew their place. Making sure people didn't get too comfortable thinking they had rights that applied to them. He shook his head. You weren't enforcing the law, Brian. You were enforcing your law. And now you're paying for it. Brian exhaled sharply, looking away. The weight in his chest grew heavier, pressing into his ribs, making it harder to breathe. Holloway sighed. I'm done here. Think about the deal. I'll be back when your lawyer's ready to finalize it. He turned to leave, but then he hesitated. You should know, Malcolm Wright didn't push for the maximum sentence. He could have made this worse for you. A lot worse. Brian frowned, his stomach twisting at the thought. Why didn't he? Holloway gave him a long, unreadable look before shaking his head. Maybe because he knows you'll never recover from this anyway. And with that, he walked out, leaving Brian sitting alone in the crushing silence of a life that had just been permanently rewritten. Minutes passed, maybe hours, maybe days, time no longer felt real. The door opened again, and his lawyer stepped inside, looking just as tired as before. He sat down, sliding the plea agreement across the table without a word. Brian stared at it, his pulse roaring in his ears. He picked up the pen, his fingers unsteady, hovering over the line where his name belonged. His entire career had been built on the idea that he made the decisions. That he held the power. That he controlled the outcomes. But now, all he had left was a single piece of paper that determined how the rest of his life would go. His hand shook slightly as he signed his name. The lawyer exhaled, slipping the document back into his briefcase. It's done. Brian let out a breath, slow and uneven, the finality of it sinking in. He had just admitted guilt. He had just sealed his own fate. And there was nothing left to do but face it. The lawyer stood, gathering his things. You'll be transferred to county holding until sentencing. After that, you serve your time, and then you're on your own. Brian didn't respond. What was there left to say? The door opened one last time, and 2 uniformed officers stepped inside, their expressions neutral, professional. One of them pulled out a pair of handcuffs, motioning for Brian to stand. He did. The cold metal snapped around his wrists, and as they led him out of the room, through the halls he had once walked with authority, past faces that once looked at him with respect but now only held something close to pity, he felt it. The shift. He had once thought men like Malcolm Wright had no power. That they could be controlled, dismissed, silenced. But now, as he was walked through the doors of a system he had once wielded like a weapon, he realized the truth. The only one who had ever truly been powerless, was him. The courtroom was full. Every seat was taken, every eye locked onto the front where Brian Carter stood, his wrists cuffed, his suit wrinkled, his face drained of all the arrogance it once carried. The judge presiding over his sentencing read through the charges with an air of finality, his voice echoing through the space like a hammer striking iron. The energy in the room was tense, the weight of the trial hanging over everyone present. Malcolm Wright sat in the front row, his expression unreadable, his hands folded neatly in his lap. He had attended every hearing, every meeting, every moment where Brian Carter was forced to sit in the same system he had once upheld without question. The irony was not lost on anyone. Malcolm had chosen not to push for the maximum sentence, though he could have. Not because he felt pity, but because he understood something Brian never had: true punishment wasn't just time behind bars. True punishment was knowing you would never be the same again. The judge's voice cut through the heavy air. 2 years in state prison, with no possibility of appeal. Effective immediately. Brian barely reacted. There was no outburst, no last-minute plea for mercy. Maybe he had finally accepted that there was nothing left to fight for. Maybe he had simply lost the energy to keep pretending he still had control. The officers approached him, securing his cuffs before leading him away. He didn't look at anyone as he was escorted out of the courtroom, his footsteps heavy, final. The moment he disappeared behind the doors, the room released a collective breath. Justice had been served, but it was never just about one man, it was about something bigger, something deeper. A shift. A reckoning. A moment that people would remember, not just for what had happened, but for what it meant. Malcolm remained seated as people slowly began to filter out, murmurs of satisfaction, of closure, filling the air. He didn't feel satisfaction. He didn't feel triumph. He simply felt the weight of everything that had led to this moment. A voice pulled him from his thoughts. It's over. He turned slightly to see Captain Holloway standing a few feet away, his face lined with exhaustion. There was no victory in his tone, only resignation. Malcolm studied him for a moment before nodding. For him, maybe. Holloway exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. You didn't have to come to every hearing. Malcolm's lips pressed together. Yes, I did. Holloway let out a tired chuckle. You know, he used to be one of my best men. I really thought he was different. Malcolm gave him a long, measured look. Maybe that was the problem. Holloway didn't argue. He just nodded, as if finally accepting something he should have seen long ago. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the sea of people still lingering in the room. Malcolm sat there for a few more moments, absorbing the gravity of it all, before finally rising from his seat. As he walked out of the courtroom, he felt something shift, not just within himself, but in the world outside those doors. Change wasn't easy. Justice wasn't always immediate. But today, it had arrived. Brian Carter spent the next 2 years in a cell that felt smaller every day. The men he had once judged, once dismissed, once treated as less than human, now he lived among them. The respect he had once demanded was gone, replaced by something cold and hollow. There were no shortcuts here, no authority to hide behind. Just time. Endless, unforgiving time. By the time he walked out of that prison, he was a ghost of the man he once was. No badge. No career. No future. Just a name that people whispered about in cautionary tales. The world had moved on without him, and he had no choice but to move on with it. But the scars of what had happened would follow him for the rest of his life. And maybe that was justice in itself. Malcolm Wright continued his work on the bench, his rulings carrying a weight they hadn't before. His name had become more than just a name, it had become a symbol of change, of accountability, of a new era. But he never let the moment define him. There was always more to be done, always more battles to fight. And he would fight them, just as he always had. Because justice wasn't just about a single moment. It was about making sure that moment meant something. And it did. Now, let's take a moment to reflect. How many times have we seen stories like this play out, but with no consequences? How often have those in power used their position to act without accountability, without thought for the lives they affect? And more importantly, how often have they gotten away with it? Power without responsibility is a dangerous thing. But today, in this story, we saw what happens when that power is challenged. When it is held accountable. When the scales finally begin to balance. So, what do you think? Did justice prevail? Did Brian Carter truly learn the weight of his actions? Let us know in the comments, we want to hear your thoughts. And if you enjoyed this story and want more powerful narratives with twists and turns that keep you on the edge of your seat, make sure to subscribe to Tales of Twist. Hit that like button, turn on notifications, and join us for more stories that challenge, inspire, and leave you thinking long after they end. Until next time, stay sharp, stay aware, and remember, justice always finds its way.